You begin with an assumption that appears natural. The mind is the highest instrument of understanding. You rely on its explanations, its categories, and its arguments. You assume that clarity deepens only when thought expands. Yet when you observe your experience carefully, you notice something unexpected. Certain truths do not become clearer through thinking. They become clearer when thinking weakens. Al-Ghazali encountered this early in his search. He realized that the mind, while powerful, is not the final organ of understanding. There comes a point when the heart, not the emotional heart, but the inner faculty of direct perception, begins to see what the mind cannot conclude. You begin to ask, what happens when the heart surpasses the mind in its ability to know? Al-Ghazali lived in a world ruled by reason. Philosophers built systems grounded in logic. Jurists refined legal structures. Theologians defended doctrinal frameworks. Scholars believed that the mind alone could reach truth. Yet Al-Ghazali observed the limitations of this environment. Brilliant thinkers defended incompatible positions, each certain of the purity of their reasoning. He began to see that intellect alone could not resolve the deepest questions. The world around him valued the mind, but he sensed that something beyond the mind was needed. Al-Ghazali discovered through careful examination that the mind has a definable boundary. It can classify, interpret, compare, and criticize. It can refine arguments and expose contradictions. But the one thing it cannot do is transcend its own structure. When confronted with questions about meaning, purpose, existence, or certainty, thinking reaches its limit. You begin to notice this in yourself. No matter how much you analyze, a point comes where further analysis does not resolve the question. It only multiplies interpretations. Al-Ghazali realized that the mind can describe truth, but it cannot create the foundation of truth itself. You rely on thought because it feels authoritative. Its clarity appears convincing. Yet if you look closely, you see that thought is limited to what it already knows. It arranges familiar concepts, but it cannot produce the ground of understanding from which concepts arise. Al-Ghazali recognized this when he examined the assumptions behind his beliefs. Every argument relied on premises that themselves depended on earlier premises. These premises were accepted, not proven. He realized that thought builds from assumptions it cannot justify. Once he saw this, the authority of thought weakened. You begin to see the same weakness in your own reasoning. Thought is useful but not ultimate. When you try to force thought to deliver certainty, it produces circular reasoning. When you try to force thought to produce peace, it produces further questions. This insight leads to a subtle shift. Thinking remains valuable, but its scope becomes clear. It is an instrument of refinement, not an instrument of truth-making. It cannot decide what is real, it can only examine what is perceived. And so you ask, if the mind is not the final authority, what faculty takes over when the mind reaches its boundary? Al-Ghazali gradually turned toward the heart, not as emotion, but as inner discernment. He defined the heart as the faculty of direct recognition, the capacity to perceive truth without constructing it through reasoning. The heart does not argue. It sees. You begin to understand this through introspection. There are moments when you recognize something without explanation. You sense alignment or misalignment instantly. The mind can justify or deny this recognition, but the recognition itself does not depend on justification. Al-Ghazali realized that the heart perceives in a different mode than the intellect. The intellect divides and compares. The heart integrates and recognizes. The intellect doubts. The heart observes. The intellect constructs. The heart receives. This is not a dismissal of thought. It is an understanding that thought is secondary. The heart perceives truth. The mind articulates it. The heart recognizes reality. The mind interprets it. You begin to see that the heart's clarity does not compete with the mind's logic. It precedes it. And so a deeper question arises. Why does the heart sometimes know what the mind cannot yet understand? There comes a point in inner development when the heart becomes more attuned to truth than the intellect. This is not sentimentalism. It is a cognitive shift. The heart stops being subordinate to the mind and begins to lead it. Al-Ghazali experienced this transition during his crisis of certainty. When the intellect failed to provide stable foundations, the heart perceived something the mind could not reach, a direct awareness that did not depend on argument. This recognition dissolved his intellectual paralysis. You begin to notice the shift in yourself. When thought reaches its limit, the heart continues to function. When the mind becomes entangled in contradictions, the heart sees clearly. When reasoning breaks down, the heart is not confused. This does not mean rejecting thought. It means reordering your internal hierarchy. The heart becomes the primary faculty for perceiving truth. The mind becomes the secondary faculty for describing it. You realize that the heart grows by removing distortion, fear, desire, bias, expectation. Once these distortions weaken, the heart naturally sees more clearly. The mind cannot compensate for a distorted heart, but a clear heart can guide a confused mind. This leads to the essential insight. Clarity begins when the heart surpasses the mind's need for explanation. When the heart begins to outgrow the mind often resists. It views this transition as a threat to its authority. The mind demands explanations, justifications, and proofs. It fears losing control. Al-Ghazali recognized this resistance in himself. His intellect wanted dominance. It insisted that truth must be reached through argument alone. But he saw the flaw. The intellect wants to be the gatekeeper of reality, even when reality exceeds its capacity. You notice the same pattern in your own thought. The mind wants to explain everything. It wants to confirm its conclusions. It wants certainty produced through analysis. But when confronted with truths that cannot be reduced to concepts, thought becomes frustrated. The mind's resistance is not malicious. It simply fears irrelevance. But the heart does not seek to replace the mind. It seeks to orient it. When the heart leads, the mind becomes more accurate. When the mind leads without the heart, the mind becomes reactive and rigid. You begin to see that the mind must surrender its claim to total authority. Only then does it become free to operate correctly, as an instrument rather than a sovereign. This brings you to another realization. The mind cannot accept being surpassed until it recognizes its own limits. Once you see that the heart perceives and the mind interprets, your internal hierarchy begins to shift. You stop expecting thought to perform tasks it cannot accomplish. You stop forcing the mind to produce certainty. You stop demanding explanations for experiences that do not arise from reasoning. Al-Ghazali described this shift as the reorganization of inner authority. Truth is no longer determined by intellectual dominance but by inner clarity. The heart establishes the direction, the mind follows. You begin to perceive the difference between knowledge that arises from the heart and knowledge that arises from borrowed concepts. Heart-based recognition is quiet and stable. It does not need repetition. It does not fluctuate with emotion. It does not depend on argument. Mind-based conclusions, however, require reinforcement. They must be defended. They must be justified. They require maintenance. You see that the heart's recognition has a quality of simplicity. It does not struggle. It does not assert. It knows without insisting. The mind's reasoning has a quality of complexity. It builds, compares, and evaluates. When the heart leads, complexity supports simplicity. When the mind leads, complexity overwhelms clarity. At this point, a deeper question forms. If the heart now guides the mind, What becomes of the search for certainty? When the heart assumes its natural role, certainty changes. It no longer appears as intellectual dominance. It no longer depends on argument. Certainty becomes a quiet recognition rather than a forceful conclusion. Al-Ghazali described this type of certainty as light, not in the sense of illumination, but in the sense of weightlessness. It has no burden. It has no conflict. It simply stands. You begin to notice that certainty built by the mind is fragile. It needs protection. It collapses when challenged. But certainty arising from the heart feels different. It does not need defense because it does not feel threatened. This certainty does not reject thought. It integrates it. The mind becomes an ally rather than an authority. Thought becomes a precise tool for expressing what the heart perceives. The burden of truth does not rest on the intellect. It rests on awareness. You recognize that this certainty cannot be shaken by doubt because it does not depend on conclusions. It depends on direct recognition. And you see the deeper consequence. Certainty of this kind is not learned. It is realized. Eventually, the mind accepts its role. It no longer tries to dominate the search. It no longer insists on understanding before recognition. It no longer resists truths that exceed its conceptual framework. Al-Ghazali described this stage not as the death of the mind but as its liberation. Once freed from the burden of producing certainty, thinking becomes lighter, clearer, and more accurate. The mind functions optimally when it is not pretending to be something it is not. You begin to see this in yourself. Thought becomes quieter. It no longer interprets every experience. It no longer produces narratives to justify your state. It simply analyzes what needs analysis and rests when analysis is unnecessary. This is the mind's natural state, not constant activity, but selective activity. Not constant interpretation, but precise interpretation. Not constant effort, but appropriate effort. You recognize that when the heart leads and the mind follows, understanding becomes balanced. There is no internal conflict. Clarity emerges without strain. Truth becomes accessible without force. And you see that the inner transition has completed. The heart now guides, and the mind now serves. As the inquiry settles, the inner tension dissolves. The heart's recognition and the mind's reasoning no longer compete. The hierarchy is clear. The heart perceives. The mind expresses. Awareness guides. Thought supports. Al-Ghazali saw that when this integration occurs, understanding becomes effortless. The mind no longer demands certainty. The heart no longer struggles to be heard. Thought rests when truth does not require articulation. The stillness that emerges is not an achievement. It is simply the absence of conflict between your faculties. And in that absence, clarity becomes natural.